Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good afternoon, all our participants online and offline. Ibu Aisin, Pak Michael, and also Pak Ruko, Pak Satya, Bu Santi, Bu Wati, and all the students already here joining the session on offline, and also may I also say hello to all of our online participants. I saw some of our colleagues, Prof. Nani, Ibu Retno, and also some of students and other participants. I believe it's also from outside the Undip. Yeah, it's very an honor for us here to have our international guest lectures today, far away from Griffith University. I would like to welcome Ibu Dr. Aisin. I'm sorry if I pronounce your name wrongly. Yeah, Dedek Korhut, is it correct? Dedek Korhut. Yeah, Hoes. Yeah. So Dr. Aisin is an expert in urban and environmental planning, based in or from the Griffith University, Australia, and she is also at the moment act as the chair of the Australian New Zealand Planning School Association. And last week, you just also in collaboration with other planning schools worldwide, having a international World Planning School Congress in Bali. So it's very happy for us here in Undip that you can stay longer in Indonesia and being in Semarang today and give a lecture particularly about Jakarta, climate change adaptation in Jakarta. So we look forward to have some perspective from Australia about our city in Jakarta. Without any further ado, I would like to directly pass the time and floors to you, Aisin, and please maybe you can then give the presentation and then followed by a discussion. Please.
Thank you very much. It's my pleasure to be here. I've been enjoying, it's been, I think, about 10 days. It's our first time in Indonesia and we're loving it. We're definitely going to be back. And it was my pleasure to visit Undip. Let's see. Maybe. Because otherwise okay. Is this better? I don't. Hello? Is this better? Sorry. I'll use this one. Does this work? Okay. Yeah. Sounds like it does. Does the clicker working still? Yeah. I think it's not from mine. Yeah, well, the screen is getting set up. Thank you very much for the invitation. It's really my pleasure to be here and visit Undip after the last 2 years or so. We have been doing a lot of online meetings, so it's been really great to come and meet with you face to face and see the campus, meet some of the students, and I'm looking forward to meeting more of the students after this presentation. So I didn't prepare a very long presentation because I very much would like this to be a discussion. I also want, maybe this presentation is on Jakarta, but I'm sure you may have questions on how some of these things work in Australia, and I'll be very happy to talk about that as well. So the title of the talk is Climate Change Adaptation and Resilience of Post-Suburban Development in Jakarta Metropolitan Area. I'll give a little bit of the background of the research before. So there's a new book being prepared currently about post-suburban development in Jakarta. There has been some books written about Jakarta. The last one has been 10 years ago from an urban planning perspective. And there has been a lot of large-scale development around Jakarta area in the last 10 years that book doesn't cover. And that development is really of a different nature than the development that has happened so far. So the book is focusing on this new growth areas of Jakarta which we call the post-suburban areas. So that's what the research is focusing on. And before I go any further, I would like to acknowledge my two co-authors that we did this project together with, which are your lecturers here, Paruku Setiadi and Busanti Paula Devi. They did actually the hard work. I did the easy bit. I looked at the English documents, but they had to dig through a lot of plans and policies to make this research happen. So post-suburban development, what we are talking about here is the development in the last 10 years. And we particularly focused on not Jakarta itself, but the spillover development that occurs in the periphery of Jakarta. But before getting there, a little bit about climate impacts in Jakarta. So our research as part of this book focuses on climate adaptation in Jakarta. The reason we did that is because there's a lot of work happening around development in Jakarta, but there wasn't much research on climate adaptation. But it's actually a very, very vulnerable city. And when we look at the different impacts of climate change, it's exposed to many different types of impacts, from droughts to increased temperatures to landslides, sea level rise. But when we look at the research in Jakarta, we see that most of it is focused on just flooding. So everybody is worried about flooding and nobody's really looking at any of the other impacts that much. But when you look at the geography of Jakarta, you understand why this is the case, because 13 rivers flow through the Jakarta Delta. It's very exposed to flooding, and with the land subsidence problem, the occurrence of flood increased even more. So as a problem, it's very prominent. Every time it rains, there's a flood. It's very visible. So everybody worries about it. And also, if you look at the statistics from the government websites, what we find is that 80–90% of all disasters that happen in the Jakarta area are related with water. So they are related with floods, tropical storms, cyclones, landslides, coastal abrasion. So source of most of the disasters in the Jakarta region is water. So our study area is Jakarta Metropolitan area, not just the city of Jakarta itself. So the, as you call Jabodetabek, has about 30 million people. 10 million of this live in the center, special capital region of Jakarta, but that region is very densely developed and there is not much room there. So a lot of this growth now is spilling over the borders of the city of Jakarta to neighboring cities. So we wanted to look at what's happening in these neighboring cities. Are they getting similar amount of attention in terms of planning and solving its problems? So this area is highly vulnerable to climate change. And the neighboring provinces of Banten and West Java is assuming a lot of this spillover growth, and the cities in that area, I think maybe this, oops, went a bit too quickly. This table is probably too small for you to see, but it's giving the population of each local government area and the density. And of course, the largest population is central Jakarta. The largest density is central Jakarta. The neighboring communities are slightly smaller in population and densities, but they are facing very similar problems. And they're not getting any of the attention Jakarta is getting. Part of the reason for this is, of course, Jakarta is the capital. So as the seat of the government, it receives a lot of special privileges. It receives a lot of government funding that these neighboring areas that face similar problems aren't getting. When we look at how this area is preparing for climate adaptation, what we see is that there isn't much talked about climate adaptation. There's a lot of talk about disaster management. How do we manage floods? How do we manage landslides? How do we manage disasters? But not future focused, how do we adapt to climate change? And what makes it even more challenging in the peripheral areas to deal with this problem is that For example, in central Jakarta, there is a regional board for disaster management, which coordinates the activities of different government organizations that have something to do with disaster. But the peripheral areas don't have this kind of an agency. So there is no coordination of the activities. They have a lot of overlapping regulations. So it's very difficult for them to deal with the problem. So in terms of methods, we started with a literature review. We looked at what was in the literature about climate adaptation, not just in central Jakarta, but in the whole metropolitan region, all the local governments and provincial governments in that area. But the main method was a policy review. So what we looked at is we identified all the publicly available plans and policies, any spatial planning documents, development plans. So we looked at long-range development plans, mid-range development plans. We looked at different types of spatial plans. A big problem in our research was not all the documents are publicly available. So only some of the documents. So we could only analyze the plans that we could access. You would be much more familiar than me about the administrative system of Jakarta, Indonesia in general, and how it works. There's a hierarchical consistency principle in the planning. So the long-range 20-year development plan gives a general direction. The 5-year development plan has to be consistent with that. And further 1-year programs that are used for budgeting have to be consistent with that. And spatial plans are also similarly hierarchical in nature. And this system is supposed to guarantee not just vertical integration, but also cross-sectoral integration, and also horizontally between neighboring governments as well. So we started our analysis from the highest level, national government, and looked at what does the national government have in its policies, in long-range, mid-range development policies. And we discovered that there isn't much about climate adaptation in those documents. But the national government does have some some strategies that talk about this. So the important one among this is National Climate Resilience Development Policy. So this policy advocates an awareness campaign on the importance of integrating climate vulnerability, risk, and impact in urban planning and development. It's also trying to build capacity and strengthen the institutions. One of the aims is revitalizing urban infrastructure, again, to increase adaptive capacity and resilience to different impacts of climate change, and increasing urban forest areas and other green open spaces that will help with both adaptation and mitigation of climate change. So this policy is the embodiment of Indonesian government's policy and commitment to address climate change issues and challenges. And it took Indonesia maybe more than 10 years to get this point after first committing to climate change and started having dealings with the United Nations. This is fairly new, and because it's new, it didn't get passed down to all the development plans, long and mid-range development plans yet. So if we look at what the provincial climate governments are doing in terms of climate change, so we looked at the three areas here, the West Java, Banten, and Jakarta. What we found is that the most was in spatial capital region of Jakarta that had the most comprehensive and diverse policies, that was mentioning climate change the most. But even in Jakarta, the focus was mostly on disaster management. Most of it was reactive, or how do we prepare for disasters at a community level, not really those long-term climate adaptation type policies. Among the few long-term policies is development of Jakarta Coastal Defense Strategy, because the capital city being exposed to a threat from sea level rise is again a very prominent visible problem. There are some more details in especially the medium-term development plan of Jakarta. It talks about water efficiency, green building policy, again, a lot of capacity building, emergency response, but also things like protecting mangrove habitats and water catchments, which are really crucial for this. Increase of green open space. Waste management to improve drainage is very important because a lot of the times the waste that clogs the water streams is one source of or one cause of the flooding. And development of reliable and integrated infrastructure to reduce floods. So essentially better stormwater management systems. Spatial planning, at the spatial planning level, there are also policies for rehabilitating abraded beaches, developing residential islands through reclamation of land that will also work as a barrier towards sea level rise, and development of blue open space and to accommodate increasing rainfall. So, but remember again, most of these are only in central Jakarta, not the neighboring provinces. They are only for the DKI Jakarta. So if we look at the local government responses, we found, and I would pass on to here, maybe to Padeden and Busanti, that they don't talk about climate change directly. There is very indirectly, there might be policies that may also be useful dealing with climate adaptation, but they do not directly say that we're doing this for climate adaptation. They again emphasize mostly disaster mitigation, and they do have some water provision strategies because water is such a big problem. There are some transport strategies which also are relevant to climate adaptation, but they do not directly address climate adaptation. So this kind of leaves a gap when governments aren't doing about climate adaptation, but the impacts of climate change are already on the ground. Then what's happening is people are trying to respond in their own way. So if we look at what people are doing, households are trying to adapt in their own way. They can be, doing things like this, providing some board outside their door to prevent water from entering their house, or raising their appliances higher so when it gets flood, it won't get damaged. And they may be building second floors, and they do this as long as they can afford to do this. But when flooding becomes too frequent or these are not effective, as a last resort, they start thinking about moving to another house. But usually moving to other places is the last resort. So other community adaptation strategies, building second floors, so they are further removed from the flooding level, or small dikes with sandbags. These can be temporary, as when there's going to be a big rainfall event. So this is how communities are trying to manage these problems. So at the government level, there's some improvements in drainage and some government-built flood defense structures. But again, these are much more limited and they don't address all of the problem, which results in people taking it into their own hands. So if we look at our findings, the major first thing we found was there are more adaptation initiatives in the central Jakarta area than the peripheral neighboring communities that we are talking about. But even the special capital region of Jakarta is not sufficiently prepared for the impacts of climate change. Most of the stuff they are doing is focusing on floods. They are not even mentioning the other impacts of climate change. And when you look at the governments, there is this silo mentality. So despite all the intent of the planning, where there should be horizontal and policy level integration, there is no integration in practice. And this lack of integration is preventing adaptation, effective adaptation. There is also inconsistency in some of the plans themselves. On one hand, for example, they would be building some public transport. On the other, they'd be building some new highways that encourage people to drive more and hampering that increase in public transport ridership. There's also actions that are taken in the plans of one local area that has spillover effects in the next neighborhood. They're not paying attention to this kind of thing. For example, Jakarta has plans for new motorways, etc., that increases, again, driving in neighboring communities. So after we looked at what these plans and policies included, we tried to look at the theory of adaptation and see what type of adaptation we can see in the Jakarta area. So adaptation theory talks about three general approaches to adaptation. The first one is coping, which is essentially dealing with the consequences of disaster and change. It's an after the fact. So it includes how can we continue living the way we are living? So it's usually either evacuation routes, what you need to do during a hazard event, and the cleanup and going back to normal after the fact. So we call these coping approaches. Incremental adaptation is making small incremental changes in the way you're doing things. So it's still continuation of what you're doing, but with small changes. So it's extension of familiar actions. So for example, you have a levee or a dam for flood protection, you increase the height of that levee a little bit. That's an example of an incremental adaptation. So the idea is to deal with bigger rain events. The third approach is transformational approaches, which focuses on essentially a system level change, changing the way we do things, not doing the way we live, but we need to have a different way of living because we're now living in a very different world. The conditions are very different. It's going to rain much more frequently. It's going to rain in much larger quantities in smaller periods. So it's going to be much more intense with climate change. So all the climate science is saying this. So we need to prepare for this, and true adaptation to that would require that transformational change of how we do things. So that means questioning the way we are currently doing things and trying to address the root causes of the problems rather than just the symptoms. And this may require changes in behavior and technology, even changes in the way we plan our cities, in the way we design our houses, and in the way we do things. So when we looked at how Jakarta was doing based on these three approaches, what we found is that because the major focus is on disaster risk reduction, this is all reactive approaches. A disaster happens and then you react to it. Okay, what do we do now? How do we clean up and continue as we were living? So these are mostly coping mechanisms, including identification of evacuation routes, even having early warning systems. It doesn't change where you live. It doesn't change how you live. It doesn't change how much it floods. It will still flood the same way. It just gives people a little bit of time to prepare beforehand. That's all it does. So there were some incremental strategies, including some improvement in drainage networks, provision of green spaces for more capture of rainfall, slowing down of the water, more catchment management and land use controls, but they weren't significantly large enough to solve the problem. And when we looked at transformational adaptation, there was a few projects that suggested that they were transformational. These included projects like upgrading slums and naturalization of rivers and even relocating some communities. And on the face of it, these look like they would be transformational approaches. There's a vulnerable area. There are people living there where they shouldn't be. You move them to a safer place. Technically, okay, it's transformational, but what the literature tells us and the research in these projects tell us is that those relocations were not done in the way they should have been done. And they disrupted those communities. They disrupted, because most of these are poor neighborhoods, informal communities, and their way of life is intricately linked with their community. So if you transplant them to somewhere else in very different type of housing, far from where their neighbors are moved to, their social networks are broken. They cannot continue their living as they were. So what happened in these kind of cases was they were removed from one vulnerability, but they were exposed to other vulnerabilities, but they were still vulnerable. And it didn't really transform in the positive sense of helping them in this situation. Similar transformational adaptation arguments are made for the sea level rise related projects for the Jakarta Bay. Especially the development in North Jakarta through land reclamation has been very popular idea in the last 10 years. There's a lot of government propaganda around it. There's a lot of financial investment in it. It's very big projects. And they are suggesting this as a new city, and these are really mega projects. They are very, very big. And the Jakarta defense strategy eventually transformed into the Great Garuda Seawall in Jakarta Bay. But again, analysis of these projects are showing that these are maybe solutions in the short term, but they are not truly transformational adaptive projects. They will actually increase the city's vulnerability in the long term, because you're not just building a seawall, you're building a lot of very tall structures on top of it. They will be exposed to similar types of vulnerabilities. So this is the Jakarta Coastal Defense Strategy map. So they had different scenarios with different levels, and they have, you know, different seawalls that they planned to build. This was a project that started in 2012. And this project by 2014 had transformed into the even bigger project of the Great Garuda. And you can see from the pictures, these are all a lot of high-rise buildings, a very developed center here, but there's essentially two lines of defense ideally here. So there's one line of seawall here, and then the reclaimed area provides a second barrier. That's the theory. But again, this is going to be an extremely expensive project, and it's questionable whether this is the best way to protect Jakarta from sea level rise and help its residents. Especially, one of the bigger problems in the literature also focuses on floods, which is the impact itself, but the cause of what makes flood worse, subsidence, isn't something people are studying or people are trying to solve. So as long as subsidence continues, none of these projects are going to actually help, because the problem isn't just coming from the sea through sea level rise. When it rains, it's coming from the rivers. And these projects are doing nothing about the actual major problem Jakarta is facing. And another expensive big project is moving the capital. So when people think moving of the capital, they think as if the whole Jakarta is moving and everyone will be safe. But the whole Jakarta isn't moving. Just the administration is moving. 30 million people will continue to live in Jakarta, where it will be sinking, where there will be still flooding happening, despite these projects, despite move of the capital. Yeah, so this one also shows the details of the project a little bit more. So if we were to summarize, these kind of big projects are actually maladaptive planning. They are not transformational adaptation, they are maladaptive. So maladaptive is actually when you make the problem worse instead of improving. You do something for adaptation, but instead of adapting, you actually make the problem even bigger. So they may look effective in the short term, but they will raise the risk of climate-related hazards and also lead to higher economic losses in the longer term. And anywhere in the world right now, the scale of the climate adaptation problem is so big and funding is limited. So this isn't, we argue, the best use of that funding. And then the other point is we said that we could see most of the action or even policies about climate change in the central Jakarta area. But still, Jakarta has a long way to go if it's truly going to adapt to the impacts of climate change. So how do we move forward from this? One of the things that our research found out is that there wasn't a coverage of all different impacts of climate change. There wasn't even in most plans acknowledgement or listing of these are the different impacts of climate change and this is what we need to adapt to. So these plans have to integrate climate change much better, identify what the different risks and hazards are in different provinces, in different local governments, and then look for solutions. They need to cover all impacts. You know, it's a tropical country. It's very hot weather year round. For example, urban heat island is also a big problem. This is also something that needs to be managed. So there are multiple problems. The second point is that yes, the center's problems are really big and they need to be solved, but the periphery's problems are big. The periphery is growing really, really fast. Those cities in the periphery, like Depok, etc., in the area, they also have Banten, they have big problems and they are not getting equal attention, equal funding, investment. So they need to get also the same kind of attention and investment to solve their problems, because the reason they are growing is because they are neighbors to Jakarta. It's the spillover Jakarta growth that they are putting up with. Oh. It's already there. So the third point is the plans should not just be vertically consistent, but horizontally consistent, which means that neighboring local governments should coordinate their activities and make sure that what they are doing or proposing or their infrastructure investments and policies are not affecting what their neighbor is doing negatively or what they are trying to achieve negatively. Excuse me. And then the last point is that, as I said, there's a very limitless need of funding for climate adaptation. Problems are really, really big. There's limited funding. So it's important to make sure that this funding is allocated responsibly and in the places where you would get the greatest return for it. So it's critical not to invest this limited funding on very expensive but visible projects that are being criticized as a vehicle for some development interests to get rich, essentially, to open up that area to development and to make some profits out of it. So that was my last slide in terms of content. So this work is in progress at the moment. So we are very much looking forward to hearing your feedback and questions. It's being reviewed, then it will be revised, and it will be published in this book, Planning Jakarta in the Post-Suburban Era, next year. So thank you very much for your attention.
Maybe I seen Pak Roko, Bu Santi as where is Bu Santi? She's missing.
She just ran away.
She's missing. Yeah, maybe we can just directly continue with the Q&A session discussion. Please, for our offline and also online participants, feel free if you have something to ask or to be discussed. Anybody? I see some of our IUP students here. Quite a long time not to see you. Nice to meet you again this semester. You should have some questions. Normally you have questions. Yeah, I know you have questions. Please.
Okay, that's all right. Hello all, let me introduce myself. My name is Mem. I'm from the bachelor program, batch of new. First, all right. So, my question is, I remember at the last semesters I was this was I was studying about the environmental geology, and at my assignment, I was picking the case of land subsidence in Jakarta, especially because I've done some excursion to the place itself, and what I saw on your presentation is based on the finding. Jakarta has the most comprehensive policies in order to fight this climate change, and one of the facts that I found in the previous study in environmental geology is the rise of sea level is not as fast as the land subsidence. Well, as you can see, the provincial government is taking more focus on the flood, but they are not taking the land subsidence case seriously. And based on the comprehensive and the comprehensive policies in order to fight the climate change, is there any existing policies that could be improve and perfected in order to fight this climate change in Jakarta? Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you for the question. I guess, first of all, I'll clarify what we mean by the most comprehensive responses are in Jakarta. It's just comparison to outside, but they don't have enough in Jakarta either. And they don't, I'll let Ruku and Santi to respond more in detail if they wish, but there wasn't much on especially what there needs to be, first of all, is preventing people from taking water illegally by extraction. And I have read, as part of this research, a lot of research on local communities that are doing this, and they were not only they were not willing to move because of the sinking and floods, but they were also not willing to change their behavior in terms of where they take their water from. So seemingly education programs, etc., is much cheaper, but there isn't really a program to deal with this. And maybe it's not just education. Maybe there should be some, for example, economic incentives, because part of the reason why people do this is because the water there is free versus they need to pay for the alternative water. So maybe there needs to be some kind of subsidy and economic support from the government to change their behavior. So we haven't seen any evidence of these kind of programs to deal with subsidence. In my mind, as a planner, those were the two things I would do first. I would start an education campaign and program to educate people, because I don't think many people on the ground are aware that they are causing the problems themselves by extracting water. So they need to understand the relationship between their behavior and the flooding. And then the second thing is maybe some programs of economic incentives to change their behavior that causes the problem in the first place. I don't know, Ruku, do you want to add something?
Yes, thank you, Wira, Wira, for your questions. I think, in my opinion, that climate change adaptation and land subsidence is something that basically unrelated from the beginning, but land subsidence being one of variable that may complicated the way we try to adapt to the impact of climate change. I think at the ground, central government, I think, built dams in the outside of Jakarta that try to provide clean water for the Jakarta. I think it's one of substantial efforts that try to provide more water sources for Jakarta and Jakarta activity and surrounding Jakarta as well. But yeah, I think it's still progress. The government realized that situation that's from underground exploration, but I agree with Aisin that not community realize that. Maybe they realize, but there is no incentive for them to try to change their behavior. Yeah, I think it's common, and then the solution may be using a economics approach with giving incentive for the community, but the government is mostly rely on a command and control approach, with using a regulatory based approach to control the new development of a deep well, and they try to searching any deep well that is illegal. So I think that is what Jakarta government focusing on at the moment. Yeah.
Actually, that brought back to my mind an example from Australia. It's not on flooding, but it's more on droughts. So we were speaking at lunch. We've had a very big drought in from about 2000 to 2010. It lasted a decade. And during this period, there was great water scarcity. Governments had to go to water restrictions, etc. And they used this economic incentive approach very effectively. What they did was they gave people rebates for installing water tanks in their houses. So right now, the state that I live in, Queensland, has one of the highest water tank rates, stormwater tank rates in the country. And once you install that, you start using that for non-potable water needs, whether it's watering your garden, washing your car. In some houses, they either even were able to hook it up to their toilets and their washing machines. So they would use the rainwater they collected for this. So they reduced their water bills, because water is being scarce. It's also much more expensive in Australia when you pay for it. So it had great benefits. So there is a lot of evidence that these kind of economic incentive approaches work very well. Similar economic incentives, not related with water, but were given for solar panels. And again, Australia has one of the highest rates of uptake of solar panels on houses for generating electricity. So, you know, instead of building reclamation of land and giant seawalls, maybe some of that funding could be used more on community-focused projects.
Yeah, I think maybe if the budget for seawall allocated to addressing what you're concerned about, what is land subsidence, I think it's one of the beginning step before we addressing climate change. Maybe the impact of climate change, like floodings and sea level rise, will not successful until we first solve the land subsidence issues, I think.
Yeah, and I think a very good point Ruku made is the problem of climate change is it makes every problem you have 10 times worse. So subsidence is not related with climate change, but the way you're extracting water and the sinking, and the effect is that rain that comes now more often and bigger causes a bigger flood. So all of these things are very much linked in the end in terms of affecting people's lives.
Okay.
Come on, Pak Roko. Yeah, before I invite other offline participants, maybe we can move into the online participant, I think. So we have Damian here. Hello, Damian. Yeah, he's from Australia. He was here, actually, I think, joining our summer course. Yeah. Yes. The question is, with the sea wall, won't sedimentation and pollution become a very significant issue? And that sedimentation rapidly back up into those rivers. So yeah, and after that, maybe I would like to invite Pratama Belva, if you have questions, please, Saisin.
So I'm not a seawall expert and I'm not an engineer, so I don't know technically what kind of problems a seawall could potentially cause. But yes, it sounds to me that you're right. All of these things will become an issue with this kind of situation. I don't know engineering wise how the project is planned, because the only things that I could find so far were the pretty pictures and the images, not really how it works. So I don't know if they have pumping systems, if they have systems of, I think the problem with these kind of systems is that they're also very expensive to maintain. So I would expect that they would have to be constantly dredging to keep sedimentation, still having the area behind the seawalls to be the same depth. They would need to constantly be dredging, which would also be very expensive.
Yeah, actually, just adding a little bit from Semarang, it's have a similar experience, with the seawall project connecting the Semarang and Demak.
Yeah.
May I add a little bit from the question of Damien?
Please.
Yes, I think the seawall is a very great on paper. It's very ideal based on the proposal on the paper. But I think in the implementation field is a little bit different, because it's require other activity that has to be successful as well. For example, educating communities so they're not throwing the garbage or rubbish to the river that then end up as a sedimentation. So unless the community change, the behavior of community change, it's difficult to imagine that the seawall will be perfectly as it is on the picture.
Yeah, and I think the thing about seawalls is, as I said, it helps with what is coming from the seaside to the land, but it has zero help to what's coming from the land side to the sea. So the rainfall that comes down through those 13 rivers in the delta, the seawall has no help whatsoever for that problem.
Yeah. Thank you, Aisin and Pak Ruko. Now we have another questions from our online participants. I would like to invite Pratama Belva. Maybe if you don't mind, you can also activate your camera. Please raise your questions. Hello.
Test.
Yeah, we can hear your voice clearly. Please.
Okay. That's good, because I'm now in the middle of the mountain, so there's probably a disturbance in my phone signal. All right. Before I ask my question, I would like to give some insight about this problem. Yeah, it's been a how can I say that, a chronic problem in Jakarta since a long time ago, when we have a various regulation that we think can solve those problems, but it's not very easy because the people who live there is not willing to move because of the economic reason. And those Jakarta citizens which live in the north side, they don't have to water, so they extract the water illegally. When we ask them to get the water in legal ways, they don't want to, because they don't have any access. They don't have any access to the pipe waters that come from the government pumps, and so they don't willing to stop their activities, even it is illegal and cause the problem for themselves. Yeah, that's why when we ask the people to, hey, can you not to extract the water from the ground, they're not willing to, because of that problem. And my question is, as an expert of urban planning and environmental planning, what is in your mind to change those people, and how can we move the Jakarta as the central economic center of Indonesia to the other side of the Indonesia, because Jakarta, even in Indonesia, even we move our capital, it is just in administration only, not the economic. So have you what is the best strategy in your mind to solve that problem? All right, thank you.
Thank you very much for the question. That's a very, very difficult problem. Unfortunately, it's not very easy to solve, especially the second one that you're talking about. How can we make Jakarta not the center of economic activity in Indonesia? That's very, very difficult. The many countries around the world try to do more kind of what's called, I guess, economic homogenization kind of policies to decentralize. A lot of countries in the world, including, for example, places like France, have their largest cities in the center, and they try to redistribute and make regional areas grow. It's very difficult to do this kind of thing artificially. So it doesn't have a simple answer. You know, if France couldn't solve it, but I think there are things governments can do. The thing is, it's a very, very long process, but we need to start somewhere, and we need to start as soon as we can. And it requires some government investment and creation of economic activity and some attraction somewhere else. Because what is drawing people to Jakarta is the economic opportunities they find there. So you need to provide people economic opportunities elsewhere that they would choose to leave Jakarta and go there. There's no other way for this. So I don't know if the new capital is going to do this. Moving government functions is not a bad idea for doing that. But, you know, the location of that new capital, whether it's a right choice, those are other discussions that can happen. But other economic activities, whether it's manufacturing, whether it's, I don't know, IT, whatever kind of, but you need to create a kind of magnet area where there are economic activities that make it attractive for people to move to. And if you do this, it won't happen overnight, because these places, as they grow, they become more complex, and then all of a sudden they become more and more attractive. But there is a lot still governments can do to start up these kind of, you know, growth center areas. So I think that's one thing that they need to be doing. I don't know the other things. I don't know how it would be funded. This is, and again, unanswered question globally, but people should be moved from the most hazardous areas, whether it's buying them, building them somewhere else. But this is also a process that needs to happen, but maybe it needs to happen differently than the way it happened so far. It needs to happen more with community engagement, participation of those citizens, listening to their needs, and creating communities where they can continue their life similarly, so that they would be willing to move, but they are not sacrificing being vulnerable in another way just to move from a place that floods, for example. So I'm trying to think what was the first part of the question. Oh, what can you do to people to change their behavior? I think, again, I think, as I said before, that's not an easy one either. Because, you know, how many of you, if I tell you stop driving and take public transport, will be easily willing to do that? You know, we all like our comforts. We all like to be comfortable, want to go when we want to go to the door, and it's difficult. So the first thing is that we need to create alternatives that are equally attractive or even more attractive. So why don't people use public transport? Most of the time, it's not as comfortable. It may be hot, it may be dirty, it may be late. There can be a lot of stuff. If you created a public transport that was faster than your normal transport, maybe you would consider. If it was convenient and cool and clean, then you would like, well, why do I want to get stuck in traffic for, you know, an hour when I can go in 40 minutes with public transport? Then, so what we need to do is, we can't just tell people to change their behavior before providing them alternatives. We need to provide an alternative, and that alternative we provide needs to be better than what they have, so that it needs to be attractive. It may be cheaper. That's usually the only plus public transport has over private transport, but that's usually not enough. People would say, I'll pay a bit more and be more comfortable. So maybe it's time we invested in better public transport that might be slightly more expensive, but beats the traffic so that it encourages people to actually use it.
I'm not sure that I understand that the first question, but I guess that it's difficult to degrowth Jakarta because Jakarta is already become a magnet, and then it's all a market system that make Jakarta grow and grow, and then the change, the shifting of capital to Kalimantan, I think is another way to degrow the Jakarta, but I think it's also depend on, for example, you may think that the asset of the government that leave because the administration moved to Jakarta must be used in different way. Otherwise, it will just take everything as business as usual. For example, if you can convert, for example, all government asset into public space that can absorb water, for example, I think it will be help for adapting to climate change, for example, instead of using for other purposes. I think it's the way that the shifting of the capital will help Jakarta in the future. It's one of ideas.
Yeah, I don't think at this point it's realistic to completely think of abandoning Jakarta. But if the most critical areas are settlements are moved from there, those areas are vegetated, the water holding capacity of the city is going to improve as well, and it's going to help what's left as well. So I think maybe what needs to be done is kind of a good carrying capacity type of analysis to see, you know, which areas are habitable, how many people can we safely keep in Jakarta. I mean, Jakarta is there for a very long time, and it's going to be continued there in one form or another. But how can we do that safely? And how many can we accommodate reasonably? And how can we not add and, you know, the new development goes somewhere else?
Yeah, although the idea to say, to get more green space in Jakarta or green area in Jakarta with the moving of the capital is also not realistic if we think in economic way, because I think there are more opportunity loss if we just use it for green space. But the way I think depend on how we perceive the future. Maybe it's not have economics benefit, but I think social and environmental benefit maybe much higher if we count mathematically or something like that.
Yeah, that's, I think, long-term versus short-term. The economic benefits are always short-term versus the others are always long-term, and they're not monetized. So we tend to disregard them in decision-making. But what we need is truly that balance of multi-criteria decision-making.
Yeah.
We can't disregard economy because things cost money, but we need to make sure that it's balanced with the other concerns, the social concerns and the environmental concerns.
Yeah.
We as a spokesperson,
Sorry.
spokesperson of the new.
Come on. Yeah, thank you, Pak Ruko and Aisin. Yeah, it's always a hot discussion when we talk about Jakarta, and also a lot of discourse about the movement of the capital from Jakarta to Kalimantan. But now we move into the next round of the Q&A. Yes, please. We have two persons here.
Good afternoon. My name is Amin Novianto. I want to point out 2 points here. The first of all is I found that actually the marginal people which is affected by the floods and everything is poorly educated people, I would say. Yeah, so they have lack of awareness and interest for the climate change. So yeah, I guess maybe you have some solution as the government to provide that. They still have lack of interest and awareness. We can look at their behavior. They still dump their rubbish into the river, kind of thing like that, and just do such thing that is really affecting the climate. The second is we're talking about Jakarta as the one of the biggest metropolitan city in Southeast Asia, actually. And from that, we can say that there are a lot of private sectors, such as big company. They're talking about the big plans of the river walls. It's not that low marginal people that do that. It's a company, and I think it's creates such a conundrum where they pay high taxes for the government, but they'll still think about economically, not environmentally. So yeah, maybe you have a view on that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very interesting questions. I mean, the first one about people who are being most affected being poorly educated and lack of awareness. Absolutely, that is the case. And there's a lot in public participation literature on how to engage these people because it's very difficult. Like, these are the people who don't have the skills, who don't have the time, who don't understand the importance of even participating in these kind of things if you invite them into. I mean, they're trying to make their money for that day's food. So, you know, it's not anything tomorrow may not be their concern. They are concerned about today. What do we do today? So it's a very difficult thing, but I think there are still ways to reach those people through community groups, through church groups, for example, through mosques here. For example, in a lot of the Pacific Islands, a lot of the big coordination, mobilization for climate adaptation is happening through churches. In Pacific Islands like Fiji and Vanuatu, the religious institutions are one way of communities' organization. So what we need to do is for these kind of communities, find what are the channels to reach them through and use these channels. If you invite them to a meeting in the city hall, they might not come. You know, they most likely won't come. But if you organize something in the mosque, that would be very different. So we need to find the proper channels to reach different types of people. The second question about big companies that are paying high taxes, yes, that is the issue. And that's where government's role is very important, though, because government's job is not to look after big companies. Government's job is to look after citizens, all citizens' interests, but especially the citizens who can't speak for themselves. And who don't have the tools. And that's why a lot of the literature is focusing on capacity building by people. So these groups that I'm talking about, it's not just to educate people, but also build their capacity so they can see their options and make good decisions for their future. So in terms of, yeah, governments, I guess to a degree, governments also need to be educated, you know, and if people on the ground are educated, people elect governments. Governments are elected positions. So you can't change what the government is doing without changing what the majority of the people want. At the end of the day, politicians will do what will get them reelected. Number one concern of any politician in any country in the world is to get reelected. And they will do what they need to get reelected. So if people demand action on climate change, a government has to do something on that to get elected. So as planners, I think part of our job is that community education, community awareness, even awareness of politicians, you know, council members, mayors, for increasing support on these kind of policies. Otherwise, you know, they get donations. I don't know how political system here works, whether governments get campaign donations from big companies, etc. But, you know, around the world, that's how things happen. So whoever pays the money for your campaign, you protect their interests first.
Yeah, thank you. I think up to now, most of our discussions goes to the importance of education, awareness, role of local community in promoting climate change education. Yeah, I see. Yeah.
I think there was another
Yeah,
question there.
yeah. Okay. Maybe.
Yeah, thank you. My name is Ratno. I want to ask about what is your opinion about the political challenge, especially in Indonesia, which election of governor or mayor or even president happen in every 5 years, and the policy tends to follow their political agenda. How to make the policy that support climate change adaptation become sustainable? Thank you.
That's a global problem. And let me tell you one thing, you have it better than Australia. Until last year, our government was 3 years term, not 5. Now it increased to 4. So you're actually better off than us. That's a problem everywhere. This, new government comes, the policies change, everything is thrown, and you had just started, you didn't even finish. So it's a challenge. So I don't know if it's the same here, but in Australia, my observation is that there's the politicians, then there's the bureaucrats and people who actually do the work underneath them. Some of those people are very, very clever. For example, people in local governments that do work on things like climate change, that want to do things. They can be very clever in the way they write the plans so that they do things irreversible or not very easy to reverse or costly to do so. So that's one way. So I think it's just you need to devise your actions and plans and policies in a way that it's not easy to dismantle when the next government comes. Integrate in everything. For example, sometimes there's a big debate about, is it better to have a separate climate adaptation plan or integrate climate adaptation in all the plans? And people think a separate plan is more visible, but a separate plan is also very easy to get rid of. You come into government, that plan is no more, it's overdone. Versus if you integrate it, think about in your system, from your long range 20-year plan to 5-year plan to annual budgets, etc., it will be very difficult to take out when the next government comes. So what we need to do is integrate these ideas everywhere so they're not just, easily reversed with every change of government, which means that a new government who comes in who wants to do this thing has to start, in their first year trying to do things so that by year 3, 4, they've already accomplished things that aren't easy to reverse back. But I acknowledge it's a very difficult problem. We have had this problem for years in Australia. We've been going between one of the world leading in climate adaptation versus one of the worst examples that's shamed in all international meetings that, they aren't doing what they should.
Thank you. I'd like to ask, for developing countries, economy still become main priority since developing countries still have to reduce poverty, focusing on job creation, not to mention about demographic bonus. That it seems like developing countries still lacking in the policy that support climate change adaptation. Meanwhile, for developed countries, they already settled with their economic issue, so they exceed developing countries in their climate change adaptation policy. So how to deal with that?
You're right. There's a big gap in terms of the scale and type of problems developed countries and developing countries are having to deal with. And despite that, actually, a lot of developed countries are dragging their feet, trying not to do much about climate change because it costs money. But I think what we need to change is our frame of analysis. Like initially, it looks like it costs money because we look at 2 short time horizons. If we look at the longer term, and the total costs of action versus inaction, we would see that we are actually better off, all of us, developed or developing right now. But I think the important thing here is sometimes those dichotomies aren't as true as they seem. It's not the economy versus the environment. These things are actually very much linked. And there are a lot of job creation opportunities in, for example, renewable energy or in many really poor countries around the world, they found out, for example, that it was much easier to move to renewable energy because they didn't have fossil fuel energy in some areas. They didn't have an energy network before. So they didn't have this sunken investment in old style energy. So they could just bring in, solar to this area, and they had much cleaner energy already. So I think what we need to do is look for opportunities and try to capitalize on those opportunities. Where can we do this thing that we need to do to adapt and be more sustainable, but at the same time, move people from poverty to decent standard of living?
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Aisin, for your best presentation. My name is Salma Safira. I have a question. What different challenge adaptation climate change in Jakarta and Australia? And second, how to increase the capacity, then it can decrease risk and vulnerability best practice in Australia. Thank you.
Sorry, can you repeat the second one? How can you increase the capacity?
Yes, so it can decrease the risk and vulnerability in Australia.
Okay.
Thank you.
So first of all, the differences of climate adaptation. Well, I would say in some senses, there isn't much difference in many places. We are talking about, we don't have land subsidence, but all the large settlements in Australia are also located on the coast. They're all exposed to sea level rise. So sea level rise is a big concern. And big cities are already talking about sea walls and defensive structures. So it's very similar in the sense that people don't want to change their behavior. People don't want to move. They still want to have their oceanfront house with the nice view and the beach in the front. They don't want to change this, but they want the government to pay for the costs of defending them. So in this kind of, I think there is more of that we are seeing in Australia. People not only don't want to change, but expect the government to protect them from disasters and expect the government to pay the bill for whatever protected structures that they would be having. Our biggest problem, I would say, from sea level rise kind of thing is erosion on the beaches. So there has been a number of almost houses falling into the sea because the land underneath is eroding with big storms. So they want to build big seawalls and things like that. So there's big pressure for building seawalls to protect large cities. And I think it will happen in places where there's enough economic investment that they think economically it makes more sense to defend than relocate, because they don't see relocation as an option. So besides that, I think we are exposed to many different disasters. So I would say one difference is there isn't just focus on flood. Our focus changes on what was the last disaster. So we tend to forget what was the previous one. So when we were during droughts, all talk was about drought and how do we plan for water. And we did certain things that changed that a little bit, so it improved. But the problem with Australia is everything is in extremes. You either have droughts or you have massive floods. You don't have something normal. So as soon as the droughts ended, we had very big floods. So the talk was all about floods. A few years later, we had very big bushfires. So last year, 2 years ago, we had very big bushfires again. So a lot of focus and attention was on planning for bushfires. So I would say one main difference is we focus on multiple different disasters, either in different times or in different places. So some parts are more exposed to bushfires, so that's what they're worried about. Some cities are more vulnerable to floods, that's what they care about. Others that are on the coast worry about sea level rise and coastal erosion. How can we increase the capacity to reduce risk and vulnerability? So I think the previous question was very right on target on that one. What we need to do is have consistent policy. we need to make sure that our policies don't change with every new election and every new government. For example, in Australia, especially coastal policy was like this. We had a coastal policy that said, for example, you need to, this is about maybe 10, 15 years ago, it said you need to prepare a coastal hazard adaptation strategy, each coastal local government. Before governments could prepare that policy, state elections happened, that government went, the new government got rid of that requirement. So all the work people have done is thrown because it's not necessary anymore. 10 years passed, the other government came back again, the other party, brought back the same requirement and said, yes, you need to prepare, coastal adaptation policies. So they started again. So we do this a lot. It's a waste of resources to start these planning activities that you don't finish. So that consistent policy, and you can't keep doing and undoing what you did depending on who's in power. You need to just keep going consistently with the same policy.
Sorry? 3 o'clock. Okay, please.
Thank you. So, yeah, maybe I want to introduce myself first because, yeah, a lot of students here do not know me, yeah, because, yeah, my name is Satya. I'm lecturer in Department of Geography, Universitas Negeri Semarang, UNES. So actually, I'm also alumni of this institution, yeah. Okay, Dr. Aisin, maybe I want to, view on another side, yeah. I mean, you have talked about that our spatial planning is maybe more disaster management approach than climate change adaptation. Of course, I think that it's triggered with the condition of our country. I mean, yeah, like you said in Australia, we have also multiple disaster. So it become the mainstream. The disaster management become the mainstream in our spatial planning. I mean, how we should integrate that concept in the spatial planning. So what do you think about what are you think? So what need to be changed? I mean, yeah, what need to be changed in the big picture or in the mainstreaming about the climate change adaptation?
I think absolutely we need disaster management, and we need really good and coordinated disaster management because these events are going to happen in every country. It may be a different event, but for example, they're not climate related, but in this country you have earthquakes and volcanoes. So there are many different disasters that you need to prepare for. What we mean by when we say it's more focused on disaster management than climate adaptation is the reactive nature of it. Planning is all about being proactive and looking toward the future and anticipating what's going to happen and prepare for it before it happened, because that's how you reduce the impacts as much as possible. If you're reactive, you're sitting here after it floods, okay, how do we clean up? Or we know this rain is gonna come, we're just gonna let people know in advance so they can, move their belongings higher up, maybe block their houses with sandbags. But you're not changing anything big. So this is what we mean. So I think what we need for mainstreaming climate adaptation is changing that reactive focus to a more proactive focus and start thinking about, okay, we know this kind of rain is gonna happen. What can we do? So, for example, less places flood, first of all. Where can we find location for this water to go so it doesn't go into places we don't want? Because that's a law of nature. If that rains, that water needs to go somewhere. If we blocked where it used to go, if we build on the land where it used to go, it's going to go somewhere we don't want. So, for example, I mean, I know you have a big history with Dutch colonialism, and I know that the Dutch are behind a lot of these Great Garuda projects and a lot of the water management projects here. The Dutch started this project in Netherlands called Space for Water. And it's all about naturalization of rivers and providing space for the water to go. They talk about space for water. So those are the kinds of things we need to do. We show water where it needs to go. And Ruku talked about the sponge city kind of concepts and these kind of designs. So we need to start doing these kind of proactive things so that we can direct where the water is going to go. We can not only prevent flooding, but it will also be an additional source of water. So it's not just eliminating flooding, but it's also water storage for when we need the water. And then maybe some of that water can be distributed free for these people who are extracting the water. So there's different projects that could be done, but main thing is, I think, more proactive thinking and future-focused decisions.
Yeah, thank you. I think from reactive to proactive action. Yeah, any others, please? From the online participants as well? No? Yes, please.
Thank you for the opportunities. I think it's also a cool and interesting discussion we have today. And then, so I have seen the discussion also and heard the discussion that actually most of the problems regarding the climate actions and also the flooding have been known by most of us, and most of people have actually known about it because it's also oftenly bring up to the news. So maybe before like also the problems of land subsidence, if we see, I don't know if it's because the economic problems, because as we seen that actually people living there are now doesn't have access to clean water, but they need to buy water, which actually are costly too. So I don't know if the economic is really the problem, but as we could know also that in Jakarta, the access to clean water have not been could be accessed by all the people. So I guess it could be one of the problem. And then you've also mentioned about the silo mentality, because we know that in Jakarta and other regions are different government or administrative, they have administrative boundaries. So it also creates different regulations and policy. So maybe I want to ask regarding how we as planner, because we have known the issue and we have proposed our solution to the government, but maybe is there any solution for us that we could push the government to do some action? Because I guess the problem is not only in the identifications of the problem, but more on the action. And maybe is there also any best practice or lesson learned from the Australian government? Because you've also mentioned that you've worked in Australia with the many people in the Southeast Queensland Council. So I guess you've know a lot of how the governmental work, and maybe is there anything that we could apply here in Indonesia, especially in Jakarta and the other city around Jakarta? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. First, I would say that I found what you said about, we see flood, we know the problem because it's in the news a lot. Did I understand you right? You said subsidence isn't as much in the news? Did you say subsidence isn't as much in the news as floods?
It's also in the news.
Yeah, because I think outside of Jakarta, outside of Indonesia, we hear a lot about Jakarta is sinking. More than floods. That's just what we keep hearing all the time because it's a very big city. It's a big news. What kind of solutions we can propose to governments? I think. I think it's not just governments, as I said. I think and the best practice and lessons learned. As I was saying earlier, we have had shift in climate policy, especially at every level of government in Australia, from being really proactive, doing something about climate adaptation, to not doing anything. And these periods were really, really different, and planners used different tactics in these periods to get what they wanted. For example, there was a period where you could not talk to government officials about climate adaptation because the state government and the national government didn't believe in climate change, didn't care to do any policy about climate adaptation. So if you went to them with a project on climate adaptation, they wouldn't listen to you. The mayor of the city that I work in would just leave the room if somebody started talking about climate adaptation. So what the planners did in this time was very clever. They didn't talk about climate adaptation. They talked about disaster resilience, because the things you need to do on the ground are the same. And no politician can say, no, we don't want to be resilient to disasters, especially because Queensland is the most disaster-prone state of Australia. So we have all of the disasters. We have cyclones and tropical storms. We have floods and droughts and bushfires, all kinds of disasters we have. And every year they spend a lot of money after each disaster, cleaning up afterwards and trying to rebuild. And so that's what they went around it. So I think it's also important being in tune with politicians. What are the key words they don't want to hear, and what are the words they want to hear? And I always tell my students that communication skills is one of the most important skills a planner has. You need to be able to communicate, but also that includes understanding what language you need to use with what group of people. So the language you use with community would be different than politicians, and it would be different than what you use with planners. So right now, for example, one of the big no words in Australia in general is managed retreat from sea level rise. Nobody wants to hear the word retreat because nobody wants to move, but the local governments are aware that they need to retreat from some areas, so they're finding other words. They call them transitioning and repurposing, but they say no, they didn't put retreat in any of the coastal plans because it's too controversial. Communities don't want to hear that word. So I think some of the lessons is using those communication skills. Being politically savvy is very important for planners. We are not just technical experts. We need to persuade people, politicians, that the advice we give them is the best possible form of action. So we need to have that good communication skills to be able to convince people that what we are suggesting is the best way forward. And also that requires good relationship, being involved in your local community, especially I'm in the academia, so I'm a lecturer, but we do projects with government so that we have knowledge of what's going on in government. We know people, they tell us what's happening, or they come to us for advice when there's a need. So having good networks and relationships, even if you work as a practicing planner in one organization, you have all your cohort of friends that will be working in other organizations, and keeping that networks is very, very important for even the coordination kind of stuff that I was talking about between different organizations, because we try to make these from formal channels, but a lot of the time coordination between agencies happen because of personal relationships, because you know people in the other organization and you just make a phone call to your friend and it's easily done, versus through formal channels it will take you 2 weeks to get anything.
Yeah, very great message, I think. So for our students, yeah, communication skills is important, expanding networks, so don't be shy.
That's right. You can't be shy. If you're shy, you can't be a planner.
Yeah, thank you for sending the message to all of us here. Any other, or maybe Pak Ruku or Bu Santi, do you want to add something? Somebody on the chat room, maybe Mas Imam, could you please help me to show the chat room on the Zoom? Yeah. Oh, from Damian again. Just a few hours ago, Australia just passed the climate change bill. So climate action has literally just become law. Could this be a good model for Indonesia? Maybe some comments from you, I think.
I have done a lot of research in Australia about why local communities are acting or not acting on climate change. And one of the major findings was that if there is a federal or state government directive, local governments are more likely to act. So in places where the national government or state government, even during the times where there was no push to do something, many local governments didn't do anything. So it is very important from the central, that consistent message going all the way through. So if the federal government does this, and that's why I think the national strategy right now, or the national resilience policy, is a good step, because that's going to push all the new long and mid-range term plans to change their focus, or maybe include more climate change. So I think it would be a good idea. I think that around the world, national governments have to be more strong in pushing the lower levels of government to take more action on both adaptation and mitigation.
Yeah, thank you. But I think even, I don't know whether Pak Ruko or Bu Santi will add something on this, but even in Indonesia, I guess there's quite a big gap, between the national government and the provincial and the local government. There's already a kind of strong push actually from the national government, but somehow because of different capacity among the local governments here in Indonesia, then the reaction or the way the local government then following with the more detailed regulation or policy at the local level is very limited.
I think it sounds sometimes the solution to all these problems is money, but one of the main differences between the coastal policy 10 years ago, which asked for coastal adaptation strategies, and the current policy was, this time around, state government gave local governments money to do the planning. And that meant that right now, I think they have about 30 plans prepared. There's about 40 coastal local governments in Queensland. Because they gave the money, most places did that. So they had to start with inventorying what are the different hazards that we are exposed to, what are the different impacts, what can we do. So sometimes this kind of support also helps, because I think very good point, depending on how rich or big they are or small they are, different governments have different capacities and able to deal. Some of them can barely function their daily things, and they don't have the capacity to take on especially something like climate adaptation if they don't have any knowledge. So I think another important point here is education of planners, which is a discussion we are currently going through in Australia. How can we teach climate adaptation? How can we make that part of our education so that our graduates would go and, look for every opportunity so that every decision made takes into account climate change. And continuing professional education also then has a great role, because there's generation of planners out there who were educated before climate change was known about, and they're still working as practicing planners. So how can we make them aware? How can we bring them up to date with this kind of concerns so they integrate that to their practice?
Yeah. And I think in our department, we have Pak Ruko here act as the climate change ambassador. In the department, to promote to our students the importance of climate change issues, and maybe expectedly in the following years we have more and more students that take some topics on climate change and resilience, Pak Ruko also. Anyway, are there still questions, or please allow me, we still have questions, we still have time. I just please allow me to have also one small question to you, and also Pak Ruko and also Bu Santi. I would like to bring our discussion back to Jakarta again. We talk a lot about policy and regulation and governance and so on in our discussion this afternoon. I would like to know your further opinion about the situation in Jakarta related to the governance system. We know that in Indonesia, Jakarta have the spatial authority and also have a great capacity compared to other local government in Indonesia. If you think, what do you think about it if we see the Jakarta with the good capacity compared to other local governments, but they still face the kind of problem? And at the same time, they are located in the same place with the national government because they're the capital. How do you see this in the governance aspect to promote climate change adaptation, policy and implementation in Jakarta? Please, Bu Aisin, and maybe Pak Ruko and Bu Santi as well.
Well, I think if there was political will to do it, definitely there's capacity in Jakarta to do it. If there's capacity in Indonesia, it's first in Jakarta, as you said, because it's the center and there's all the investment, all the ministries, all the manpower, all the resources of the whole country is concentrated there. So if there was political will to do something about climate change, they could do it. On the other side, usually this is how it happens. The greatest strength of a place is also its greatest weakness. Like the same thing is both the source of your strength and source of your weakness. Because it's at the center of the capital, also that pressure from private interests who are trying to make profit out of development in Jakarta is also much greater than everywhere else. So there's kind of a tension in between these two forces, and the policies we see are outcome of this tension. Whichever side is winning at one point, that's the kind of policies that we end up with. So I think that's the struggle for Jakarta. On the one hand, there is all these resources. There's a major problem. It's a very visible international problem. So there's a push to do something to manage this problem. On the other hand, there's some very powerful national and international interests who are seeing this as an opportunity to make further profit, open new areas to development, want to undertake things that they already wanted to undertake. So some of the readings that I made for this paper talked about, for example, that this land reclamation projects and redevelopment of North Jakarta was an idea that was around for a very long time. Right now, the argument is that they are using climate change as an excuse to make it happen. Look, this is going to make us adapt to climate change. So I think that's the problem of these kind of places, is that there isn't just resource there, but there's also great pressure on profit.
Yeah, thank you for the insight. Please, Bu Santi.
Yeah, thank you, Vivi. Actually, if we look further from the DKI Jakarta Spatial Plan, actually they mentioned that they realized that not only as an administrative city, but also as a capital of Indonesia. So they realize this function, double function. So they are welcoming to all of the another area to have like collaborations, not only mainly in the economic, actually investment, something like that, but I think it is also can be related to the actually not climate change adaptation, but in the disaster management. But unfortunately, like Bu Aisin mentioned, in the spatial plan of the several area not mentioning about that, but I think at least they concerned about disaster mitigation. I think it's a good point for the beginning. It means that actually the government itself considering about their position. So I think it is a good point to have like a collaboration further with the others. Thank you.
Maybe, please.
Yeah, I think it's a difficult question, Bu Vivi, and I agree with Aisin and Bu Santi. But I think in terms of governance, I think in my opinions, Jakarta governance in terms of provincial government it's more advanced in comparisons to the other surrounding regions. So at least from the policy point of view, what is available in the document, Jakarta is has the best, I think, the best policy and the best vision and idea about climate change in comparison to the surrounding administrative regions. But the problem then is not all the good on paper will be implemented, because there is an issue of coordination and then it's not in align one another. I think it's the problem. One of the issue of the governance issues in the area of climate change, as well as there is also a character competitions between idea. Maybe the issue of poverty is more important from the government point of view instead of climate change, or maybe the issue of how to promote local economic development is more important. So yeah, it's about priority. It's not yet become a priority in comparison to other aspect of development. Although at the central government is good as well, because recently they just released in spatial planning, for example, new manual for spatial plan. They release a requirement that's to make a spatial plan. One of maps for data is include a vulnerability maps that must be included in this spatial planning.
Yeah. So if it's about priority, then referring to what Bu Aisin has mentioned before, then we need to make a good narrative, yeah, for the politicians, so they can regard this as also a priority as well. Maybe combining the climate with the poverty issues and also other economic issues to make it more attractive. Yeah.
Well, I think one of the things is, governments are always very much concerned about international investments. So if you can frame it as something like, there's not going to be international investment in a sinking city.
Yeah.
You need to protect it and make sure that their investment is protected.
Yeah.
Then, it would be. So a lot of the times what we find what's most effective is not environmental arguments, but economic arguments. So how can we make the argument economic and show them that it actually makes economic sense to do this? It's not just for environmentalism.
Yeah.
Then it would be very different, because politicians will listen to that.
Yeah.
Co-benefits.
Yeah, the co-benefits. Yeah. So again, yeah, for the participants, mostly for our students, I think another important message is how we be able to create the right narrative, yeah, to attract our targeted people, become attractive, yeah, to the message that we would like to deliver. Yeah, like Bu Aisin has mentioned. Okay, I think we can end our lecture and also discussion session today. Yeah, and I believe there are a lot of important message, a very nice and interesting presentation. Thank you, Bu Aisin, and I hope it will attract more attention for our offline and online participants, mostly our students, to have more concern on climate change issues. And last but not least, also all the best with the research together with Pak Rukuh and Bu Santi. We look forward for you, and also Mike, thank you for having more collaboration with Undip, with our department. Again, thank you very much, and applause to our guest lecturers today. Yeah, and maybe just like our normal procedure, Pak Rukuh, we should have the photo session or not? Yeah. Yeah. Mas Imam, please help us, yeah, with the photo session. So please, the online participants, if you are still joining us, thank you. And if you don't mind to stay a bit a while and activate your camera, and we can have a joint photo session with the offline participants. And for all, please, we can take the picture here, yeah, Mas Imam, yeah. Yeah, okay. Hello, come on everybody. Again, like Bu Asin said, don't be shy. Please, Pak Satya.
Please.
Duduk atau diri? Duduk. Oke. The photographer said please have a seat. Oh, yeah. Then please join us here. Pak Roko. Ayo Pak Roko.
Tim hore. Biar miring. Ini ke atas. Sebagian sana.
Pindah ke sana, Mbak.
Iya.
Oh, ada yang pakai HP di sini ya.
Oh iya.
Iya, foto Mas.
Iya, Mas.
Pak Roko. Banyak. Wah, satu lagi ya, pakai HP.
Ya, sorry. Oke. Wow. Thank you, satu.
I hope that is not too long, yeah.
No, that's very good questions, though. No, I think it's good to have this interactive sessions rather than just talk. So
Yeah. I also enjoy just wondering if maybe too long. Very exhausted.
no, I have a class I teach 6 hours a day.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
Now the studio I'm teaching 2 hours of it is lecture, so it moves to the morning, and in the afternoon I teach 4 hours.
Wow.
Yeah.